doesn't want to. Okay. All right. We have. Well, I'm going to let Mark start because he's put a bunch of thought into it. So share with us what you did.
Okay, this is musings when I got home last week, or a couple of things happened, probably in the middle of the night. If identity is about perception, at least for now, there is who I think of myself as, and there's who everyone else sees me as because of what I do. And then there's what God sees, which is both what I think of myself, what other people see me as, and I guess his intention. And is identity just the sum of everything that I've been, or is identity primarily who we were meant to be, and especially as a created being, who we ultimately who we're becoming? And then that, if it is that, that would be in God's hands to some extent, fully or as much as we submit. Then there's a question of destiny, but that's not really. Since I'm not an essential being, the question I brought to myself is, can any of my characteristics then be essential? But I think we define essential differently. But since I'm a created being, isn't my identity fully in the hands of my creator? The potter and clay vessels, of course, and how much do I participate? And no matter who I think I am, and this is a common identity today, isn't it what I say and do that ultimately determines who I am? Like if I think of myself as kind and generous, but I treat everyone else mean and stingy, am I kind and generous? Or deluded? Ultimately, as I mature, how I act tends to line up more with how I perceive myself, but I don't know if that's because I'm getting better at doing as what I perceive myself as, or if I'm getting more realistic in how I perceive myself. My self-identity, I said that. Since I believe that God created me as a spiritual being who's living in a carnal dwelling, eventually some sort of glorified dwelling, my identity is first a creature of God, created with a purpose which is unfolding before me. I am in some way participating in that unfolding. And my desire is to do better in participation. And I question myself as I say my desire is to do better, but I'm not doing that well, so I don't know how I'm creating myself. So the original question, how do we become the person God intends for us to be? The well done, good and faithful servant. And because that identity should be the only one that matters, the one who God knows. Any self-identity that differs from the way that God sees us, and we don't always, the question was, how do we find that out? We don't always know what that is, but anything that differs from God's intention for that, is that rebellion, idolatry, laziness? The moment I became a Christian, my self-identity began to change. That's very true. Accurate and successful identity would be being exactly who and how God wants me to be at every moment, each moment at a time. My identity is creation of God, child of God, servant of God, friend of God, follower of God. I am who God says I am. We sing a song with that. Not one of my favorite songs. It would seem any more or less than being what God intends me to be would be sin, or at least loss, if we don't want to be sin. My loss, if I'm not being all that God intends me to be. So that was me just like thinking all this stuff out. And I like this class because I go home and I think all this stuff out. Sometimes I go home and I don't like the class. But I thought this was a good discussion.
Why is there a judgment day?
If we don't come up with a good answer, can we do away with it?
I don't think so.
No.
I don't think that's on the list of options, unfortunately.
God is essentially
So the one Terminator
just.
movie wasn't enough.
One Terminator movie wasn't enough. Peter's right. T2 Judgment Day. We're doing it again.
God's essentially just.
Yeah, but why judgment? Okay, and
And he judges.
but why? Why at the end of what? Like when is Judgment Day? Why a day? Why a particular day? Tuesday. Why? Yeah. Why Tuesday, November 4th, whatever.
Well,
Because it's got to end at some point.
But why that point? Like, what's the purpose? Why is there a Judgment Day?
It's
Not why is there judgment? Why is there a Judgment Day?
separating the winners and losers.
Of what game?
The game of life, the game of, being with God and heaven for eternity.
Reconciliation of what?
Me, to God.
Okay,
Because
but
in a perfect God, I'm not perfect. God wants to reconcile me to Him. He has to sort out in some manner those that are in and those that are out.
if he wants to
That's
reconcile, he could have a reconciliation day.
judgment. Sorry, what?
If he wants to reconcile, he could have a reconciliation day.
It could
So
have.
we need to define.
But the way He does it is through sorting it out.
I mean,
Sorting what out?
The judgment.
What judgment?
Oh, come on.
I'm coming.
Well, but
You're
living
making
in
a
Christ, do we?
No,
do
well,
we
I'm
have
asking.
to come into judgment?
Because whatever needed to be done is now
You're
finished.
looking for an answer.
I'm looking for an answer.
You're looking for a preconceived answer.
Not true.
And so you say.
I don't know the answer to this question. Steve Ramsey
Answer the question
says, say again,
with a
Steve?
question.
So whatever has been planned or needed to be done at some point, therefore it must have a conclusion. If there was a planned order or a planned series of events, then this must be the conclusion of it. Now why, I think, is the bigger question.
Okay.
I think it could be for multiple reasons.
Yeah, Michael?
It only makes sense if you have a standard that you're being judged to.
Yes?
Well, yeah, also, I think, and how are the different camps gonna be judged? Some people think that Christians,
Forget the how. Forget the how. I'm just getting it to why.
well, I mean, because part of, for me, if I stand before God and everything I've ever done is laid out, and God says, yet, you are forgiven, that entrance into heaven would foster such appreciation is just a stingy word, but, such appreciation for the mercy, for what God did for me. It's a great start to, I guess we're already in eternity, but eternity in heaven.
Okay.
I mean, the plan from the start was, like, the owner of the vineyard, his plan was to leave, and then he says, I'm gonna come back at a certain point. He comes back, I mean, once he comes back, he wants to set up things the way he likes it, or reward those that were loyal and.
So why did in the parable, how does what the parable, the owner to the vineyard leaves? Presumably the analog is God. When did God leave and why? And why is he coming, like his coming back? What was his leaving? What did that mean? And what does his coming back mean? So I think that seems reasonable what you're saying, but did God leave?
I thought maybe it wasn't referring to like necessarily God leaving, but just like there being action, like you're judged on your actions of what you've done. So it's more referring to, for you to be judged, you first have to take action.
Yeah.
So a day is just referring to the time after action has been taken.
Okay. Okay.
We created beings with like epistemic distance to make free choices. That's in a sense like stepping back.
Well, he didn't originally, right? He was walking around with people in the garden.
Right, but they could still act when he wasn't there.
Okay.
And they weren't like sealed in like the final sense. Yeah, it was a step back for evaluation of what they would do if he wasn't there.
Okay.
It would seem like without a judgment day, it's just free for all. You know, what keeps us?
Well, so, but he judges, consider, why am I blanking on Nebuchadnezzar's successor, where Daniel gets caught, the hand writes on the wall. Everybody's terrified. We've been drinking too much. Did we party too much? What's going on? Did you see that? I saw that was a giant hand. Hey, look, it's still written on the wall. Called Daniel. Daniel shows up and says what?
You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting.
Yeah, you've been judged. And now here come the Medes and the Persians. So judgment occurs throughout the Bible. So why is there a judgment day? If judgment is a continual process, that not just like allowing human judges, but God himself occasionally shows up and is like, I'm judging you at this point. You guys, earth opens up, you're judged by. You guys, flame falls down from heaven, you're out. Like, they didn't wait till judgment day for those guys. Why judgment day for the Canaanites? Like, seems like judgment shows up, so why is there a judgment day?
To me, it sounds like it kind of goes into two different parts of, I think someone kind of mentioned transition into a different place. So he's back, but now it's not going to stay the same. He wants to get it to where there's a new heaven and a new earth. So for that to happen, there has to be judgment. I think it also relates to that verse where it's saying he's giving people as much time as possible because he doesn't want anyone to fall away. So it's kind of like, why is it not yet? Because he wants everyone to know him.
So if I wasn't intentionally fishing for an answer. If I was, I think it was this, which is God seems to have this pattern in the Old Testament of, all right, this is the way we're going to do stuff. People, I'm not happy with this way. We're going to do it our way. Okay, give it your way. And that goes from like Adam and Eve. It goes to the children of Israel. We want a king. It goes family by family in some cases. But ultimately, it's like people say they want to be in charge. God says, okay, we'll see how it goes. Once they have either gone a particular distance and turned around and come back to God and been like, you know what, we regret that. Can we go back to your way? In which case he says yes. Or alternately, like he fills up the measure of iniquity or whatever the religious words are that says like, okay, you guys have done it and you've hit the limit. Now judgment comes. So if it's the case that God's intent is to get us, quote unquote, back to the garden, back to a heavenly existence where God is among his people and there is no need for the sun anymore because God is the light, and he's among his people and all that kind of revelation and future thinking. If that's the case, then at some point you have to sort and basically be like, okay, we've let all the time fill up. All the evil that was going to be done is done. We now want just good from here on out. Can I take everybody? Answer, no. Okay, how am I going to sort which ones we can have and which ones we can't have? Presumably that's the purpose of Judgment Day. So if that's arguably one of the most significant events of history, at least personally for us, we're going to say like, yeah, okay, that either turns into eternal life or it turns into eternal death. And as in terms of a fork, give me a more important fork for any individual human being. I can't think of one. So that's a very important fork. Am I going to be part of God's eternal heaven or am I not? So whoever we are, like, what are we going to be judged on?
Can I ask a question?
You just did. Would you like a second one?
Yeah, so
Okay.
So I guess the question is, why aren't we judged immediately? Why is there a delay?
Well,
So
I think
the question is, why is there a judgment day? And then the question is, why isn't there continual judgment? And why is it selective?
well, let's say there are two reasons. One is if you get certain people, everybody in this room, maybe everybody in this room, many people in this room, if you only gave them 2 years, they would have still been bad guys by then, or not fully on board of God's system, or not repentant, or whatever else. But if you gave them 6 years, turns out on year 6, they're like, oh, that's it. I understand God. Now can I come live in your kingdom and you're my Lord and Savior? So presumably it's because there's some period of time T for any individual that they need to be exposed to whatever in order to come to the conclusion of, I want to be a volunteer for the kingdom of God. Another possibility, and I think that this is in the iniquity of the Canaanites had reached its full or whatever else, which is, I think that God, being interested in justice, is not interested in people who show up to heaven. Some people have asked the question philosophically, if God knows perfectly what people would do, why let them do the evil that they would do? Why not just God say, like, look, if I had let you, these are the things that you would have done. So imagine you're on trial in heaven, and God's like, yep, I cut you off right at the get-go because this is what you were going to do. What would you say?
Prove it.
Yeah.
I didn't actually do it.
I didn't do that. And by the way, I know you say I would do that. I would not have done that. And then God is like, I'm telling you, I know perfectly. And you're saying, well, I don't, how do I know you're not lying? And then God says, like, because I'm a perfect being and I don't lie. And then the person, by the way, who's going to get thrown into hell or destroyed or whatever anyway, doesn't have any reason not to basically say back of like, well, I don't trust you. So even psychologically, you could basically say, how would you prove that to me? I think God actually is interested in people proving out who they say they are or what they say they would do. And so one of the reasons that he allows the evil to happen is so that when Judgment Day comes around, people who in court lie and say, like, I didn't kill him, presumably at home, deep in heart, know that if they did murder that person, they're like, look, I'm trying to get away with it, but I know perfectly well that I killed the person. And if they get found guilty, they may protest and be like, I'm innocent, but deep down they're like, yeah, I know I did it. Prison, they say, is full of people who didn't do it. But deep down, you know you did. And in Judgment Day, presumably you would watch all this and say, like, oh, I deserve not to be a part of this, if that was the standard. So I think that God is interested in justice and interested, furthermore, in demonstrating that justice, not only to other people, but also to the individual. So even, you'll notice the back and forth. I don't know if this is literal or it's supposed to be, just given the idea in a parable. The sheep and the goats get separated. Well, when you saw me naked, when you saw me sick, when you saw me hungry, you didn't. Lord, when did we see you? He's in a dialogue back and forth. And people are like, no, we're innocent of that. And he's like, you didn't do it for these people, you didn't do it for me. They didn't finish the argument there, but everybody reading the story presumably understands that what Jesus is saying is, if these are my children, if you are all my children, and you didn't take care of my children when you should have, then it's the same as not taking care of me, or something like that. Okay, so there's this judgment that happens based on some criterion. How much of that criterion has to do with your identity? Or is it a general measure? The parable of the stewards has these people their role was, I'm going to give you money, in this case, to invest or use. And they use it well, or alternately just hide it with a false idea of who the master is. Does their job, it seems like they were judged based on job performance in that parable. Is that supposed to be headed towards some other different non-job related point? Or does a person's identity have something to do with that?
Well, job performance is based on character. And how you do your job is based on character. It's a reflection.
Okay, I buy that. So does it matter what job you have?
So I would say no. And I would say, isn't it my identity in Christ and my association with Christ that gets me to I don't know if there's even more than one judgment, but let's just say there is one judgment. That's the thing that I would point to that gets me to even look at the rest of it. Over.
So if it's the case that does God have a job for you? We nod as Christians. How do you know that?
You mean a particular,
Yeah.
like you're in the wrong vocation? I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's hard. That's like the right.
What evidence do we have in favor of the idea that God has a job for you to do? Now, to the point that got made earlier, let's say that it's either yes or no. God doesn't have a job for you, in which case pick your own. But in regards to what job you end up in, how good a job you do is a reflection of your character. So it doesn't matter whether you're a trash man, an engineer, a pilot, a soldier, a salesman. Your character will allow you to be a good version of those rather than a bad version of those, okay? Or vice versa. But does God does he ask you to be a salesman or a EMT or a whatever? And if so, are you responsible to do that job? Let's take Jonah. Like Jonah seemed to be like, no, I'm not going to do the job. But then God chased him down and swallowed him with a giant fish and spit him back up, like kind of like, yeah, no, you're doing the job.
That's a pretty specific example. I think it's safe to say you can get involved in a job that God doesn't want you involved in, but I don't think you can go as far as say that God's got one job for you and you better get that right. Otherwise you're out of God's will. I mean,
We'll take Paul as an example. Does it matter that Paul made tents? Or does it matter that Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles? Which one of those was his job?
I see. Well, one was a calling.
What's the difference between a calling and a job?
I don't know. Just seems easier.
Fair enough.
I mean, all the examples of specific task was like direct revelation from God of what to do. And at that point, it wasn't that was a job that God had, it was a command from God that therefore became a moral obligation to fulfill. And I think like broadly for people have like gifts.
Yeah, but okay, let's take the guy who was gifted by God to be the artist who made different stuff in the tabernacle. If someone said to him, hey, like, what's your job? Would he answer like, I don't have a job. What I have is a particular set of skills. And in this case, they're applicable to making the tabernacle. Or would he say, like, no, God gave me the job of making the stuff in the tabernacle? Like, to me, in my mind,
commanded me, and I mean that it could be a job related, or it could be like, go to this place or something if it's not job related. I mean, those are all just commands from God.
What is a job?
I think a few of us are called by God to do certain jobs. I think the rest of us just have general orders.
Okay.
And it's no matter what you do it.
Well, a Marine with general orders would still tell you his job is to be a Marine.
And our job is to be a Christian.
Okay.
By that definition.
Okay.
Is that a calling? Well, being a Christian, is that a calling?
Well, I think either way, we can say the Christians are referred to as the called.
You asked earlier if the scale of judgment was consistent, and I think the answer is yes, but it scales with knowledge. And knowledge is how much God has allowed you to be exposed to his direct and specific will.
Yes.
Or how much he has led you towards something. So
Okay, I agree with this point. What does that have to do with the job?
with greater knowledge, if you disobey that,
Yeah.
I think there is greater consequence.
Okay. So is that knowledge of God had this job for you to do?
Yeah,
Or
I mean, that would be an instance. So if Jonah said no, that's kind of a big deal. God is telling you directly, and then I would say the judgment for that would be more significant.
So
by whale.
in this vein, most broadly, we could say something like this. We want to be people of the character where if God asked us to do a particular thing, we would do it. Like that's who we are. If our job is to be a Christian is somebody who says Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and so Savior means okay, that's good for me. Lord means He commands, I follow. So to be a Christian means like, yep, I'm a footman waiting in the hallway for my orders or something like that. Or I've got general orders that I execute at every given time. Be kind, be loving, think of other people first. Take care of the sick, the poor, the imprisoned,
the other side
the
of
hungry.
that coin, though, is if you've lived in a remote area and never heard of God, I think that it is still a consistent yardstick for that to be judged as less. Like you disobeyed God because you didn't know anything about him.
Right. Fair enough.
Still consistent.
But for us, I agree, but for us,
back to the definition of calling, the examples that we're pulling out of the Bible, these people were actually called by name. Paul, Paul, the guy who did the gold work in the temple was, God said, get this guy to do it.
yeah, the point I'm trying to get at is, let's take this exactly. So they were called by name to do something. So here's the total population of Christians. All of them have a general calling, be Christians. all of them ought to be in the mind, all of us ought to be in the mindset of, if God tells me to do something, I will then do it. Is it then the case that he only tells this many people to do something?
I think it has to do with us.
But let's say that's the case, then my question, let's say it is the case. And if it's not, then if the answer is no, he tells all of us something specific, you just got to learn how to listen. Then our next question is going to be like, how do I listen and what am I listening for, et cetera. For the rest, if you don't think that's the case, what job do the other people who are not specifically told, knocked off horses and told to go to Macedonia, what is everybody else supposed to do? What do you do?
Anything in line with the standing orders.
Okay.
Great Commission, follow the Great Commission, because that's kind of like the last order, the general order that was given was go out into the world and make disciples.
So then does it matter if you're a garbage man, an engineer, a pilot, a soldier, a salesman? I mean, we kind of said that with Paul, right? Making tents, maybe. Doing something else, also making who knows what. You know. Okay, fine. So are we, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say no, it doesn't matter. I think, like to your point about knowledge, I don't think knowledge is more important than the application of it.
Okay.
And so these jobs, they're constructs on our human plane.
Yes.
That give us opportunities to express the portions of our identity that God thinks are desirable.
Okay, so I'll ask this question. This is the point that if I was trying to get to a point, it's this one. If it's the case, and remember we bifurcated twice in order to get to this case, so if you back up, it may not be true. But if this is the case, that we can just pick whatever we want, while we're doing our general orders and waiting around in case God calls in the middle of this at 40 years old to basically be like, okay, you're done being an engineer. I now have a specific job for you. Go to China and do this thing. Like maybe that happens. In the meantime, if it doesn't matter, then is that part of our identity?
I wouldn't go as far as to say it doesn't matter, because I do think you are gifted in certain ways, and if you intentionally stagnate those gifts, largely at the expense of how well you perform the standing orders,
Okay.
that could be considered sin.
Okay.
So if God has made you an amazing public speaker and you have a full knowledge of scripture and you decide to be a garbage man, that's probably a bad call.
Okay.
And I do think there will be some accountability to it, but I don't think there is a value judgment of, well, you're a garbage man, so you're not important. Because if that is your giftedness,
Okay.
to work with your hands, engage with people on a macro or micro level instead of a macro level.
Yeah, and this wasn't the point I was driving at, but in support of this point, consider our gifted man of temple skill. Presumably at young age, whatever, he wasn't whispered, I mean, for all we know he was, but he wasn't whispered to by God of like, you're going to build a tabernacle someday. Maybe he just liked working with his hands and developed that and was like, I have a good skill for this. And so God put him in a situation where he came into this skill, and then God said, by the way, I want you to use this to do something else. Okay? I can probably do that. Yes?
So can you reduce that to somebody who is obedient to God versus somebody who is not? So whether they're obedient in the general things or obedient in the specific things, that is a common thing that you could kind of grade on.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to do is, in the pursuit of identity, we talked last time about whether this is a set of property, is this a adequate definition of identity? Michael says no. So what is our identity? What do we want? Let's put our definition out rigorously now.
I think it is the complete set of properties, but then the second question is which ones.
Okay, in the white corner, Seth weighing in at 155 pounds. 3 victories by knockout. In the right corner, Michael, I don't know how much you weigh. Also 3 victories by knockout, ready to fight.
I'm curious.
The question's of that person, not a person. Because if it's a person, it's like, like the essential property that every single person would have. If it's of that specific person, it's everything about that person. And then the second question is like, which ones do we think are important or not important?
Well, that's, my frustration is, if we're talking about essential properties of a human being, of a person, there are very few essential properties. There are very few properties that I can say, like, without this property, Seth would not be Seth. Your definition is that Seth is the existence of all previous past events, which create a current Seth. But if I told you, hey, if you didn't have that coffee, would you still be Seth?
That's a question of like percentage of how important you think each thing is.
So you'd be a different person if you didn't have that coffee.
Slightly, yeah.
Well, I would disagree with that. I'd say that you're the same person.
And it's like if I'm walking in as a kid and I stub my toe, it's like, okay, I'm not a different person. If I get hit by a car and I'm in a wheelchair, it's like, okay, now I'm a very different person.
I'd say you're the same person, just in different circumstances.
Now that would be Craig's view. I'm just trying to make this harder for you. That would be Craig's view, because Craig says that God has subjunctive conditional knowledge of what a person would do if the situation were different. That assumes the identity is the same. Because what a person, if the situation was different, if that made a different person, then it's not what that person would do. It's what another person would do. But it's that same identity, what this person would do if the situation was different.
In all of the situations, it includes all past tense facts about the person.
But it's a future conditional proposition.
That doesn't matter. This situation is inclusive of all past facts about the person.
But the point is, if you have an identical set of past facts about a person, and this is the way things will be, and this is the way things might have been, but will not be, God knows which of those is true. And it's not automatically false just because it was not. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a future conditional consideration. It couldn't be something God actually knew, because it wouldn't be knowledge. It's God knows what would have happened had this happened.
Again, that's a logically possible world, but it's not a feasible world.
Why is it not feasible?
Because given the identical person in identical situations, they would choose the same. They would make the same choice.
That's not what future conditional.
That's their definition of code. We went over this before.
Yes. Right. But Craig's view is that it could be different.
That's a logically code, not a feasible, actualizable code.
It's not a will, but possible. In this case, means feasible, because all of them, of the set of things that could happen, there are a large number of possibilities. There are a smaller number of feasible, and there's a single one which will happen. But it's of the feasible option. So it's feasible that David could go to this town and try to hide there. But God says, if you do that, they will give you up. And then he doesn't do that. So that was feasible. He could have done that. It was possible. It was also feasible, but he doesn't do it. So he chooses not to because of God's tip.
And important that that's not two different people. It's David in both instances.
Right. So if we suspend whatever viewpoint you're looking at and we try to run down okay, let's say that the person's identical. They could do either way. What does that imply for identity for us?
It's not just the essential. It's not simply all past events, and it's not simply the essential properties of a person. It's something that we haven't really identified.
So here's the $64,000 question. How are you parsing essential properties from properties?
I'd take a very strict definition of essential properties. Like essential properties of God are like he's non-contingent, that kind of thing. We're all contingent beings. You could call contingency an essential property of Mike. Without being contingent, I would be eternal.
So if we grant that Mike and anybody, Al, have a whole set of essential properties that make them human, what are the essential properties that differ between Michael and Al?
I would put like a unique identifier on the soul and call it good. I don't know what else.
All right.
Yeah.
Fair. Okay. What's the unique identifier?
It's written on a stone in heaven.
Yeah. Right. Yes. I mean, well done. connecting both ends of that one.
Yeah.
But help us out here a little bit. Why do I care? Why do I care? Why do we care?
Because at the end of the day, we want to read that stone. We want to, hear God say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant."
And we have a whole bunch of decisions that hit us on a daily basis where we say something, where we have to make a decision. And in America today, because our culture puts so much importance on what our job is, because we live in an industrialized society, we live in a society, period, where these jobs interact to create an economy, and the economy is the measure by which we decide whether we're happy or not, it seems, half the time or more. So if that's the case, are we just buying into societal pressure in saying, like, who we are and what we do, those are the same thing? Or is it like, doesn't matter what we do, who we are is what matters? Okay, fine. Then how are we choosing who we are? Does God call us to be somebody in particular? When somebody says something like this, I really see a heart for justice in you. Or, you're a really wise person and your wisdom should be shared amongst the people. Or, you are one of the greatest encouragers I've ever met. Clearly, God's got. Are those actual observations of some essential property that is linked to your unique identifier of the soul / the name on the stone? Or did you just choose to be that way yourself? And you could have chosen to be an encourager, or you could have chosen to be a justice person, or you could have chosen to be a wise person. And that's just reflective of the choices you've made.
I think that is how God makes some of us.
Okay,
I don't know
so
how that changes.
Steve posits that part of what's written on the stone and part of whatever the essential property is that is unique to that label that you slapped on the soul and called it good. That label includes one each justice type, also born in this, who knows what else is on there. But Steve says yes. What do you say?
I want to move away from this definition that we have on the board of essential properties being your identity. I think identity is more the set of principles or ideas or focuses or locations that an individual makes essential to their own being.
We're in physical disagreement with you here. There's intellectual disagreement, and when it's deep enough, it becomes physical disagreement.
Okay.
I think that you have the set of properties. I think essentially I can describe a set of properties that are same for everybody. What we're talking about is the values ascribed to a given property. So I collect a set of values like color of hair, and I have brown, black, blah, blah, blah. And that has to do with a property called color of hair. I can have personality. I have this property called personality, and then I ascribe values to that particular property. I think the properties are essentially the same with all of us. I can identify a given property, and it's the same. We all have that property. Now, what's the value that we ascribe to that property? And I think that value will change over time. The value of my color of hair has changed over time. Right? In fact, it can even lose that property. So I think we're getting caught up here in a word game that it's the set of properties with ascribed values. The values will change the property itself. What we call that property doesn't change.
The properties you're describing, you have no control over that. And I think a lot of the properties that make us us.
I have control over that property. I have control over the values of some properties, and some properties I don't have control over.
There's a whole aisle at Wegmans.
I don't have control over the property of my parents.
But that's a physical description of what you are or who you are. But that's not your identity.
Yes, it is. Yeah, because my identity contains two things. It contains my personal identity, myself, and then my exposed identity. So my thoughts, the things that I think, that's part of my identity. The things that I do is part of my identity. My appearance is part of my identity. My style, my personality, that's part of my identity. And then I have certain things inside of me that's part of my identity. My desires, my thoughts.
Okay. So it's more than just your physical side. there's
Yes.
something in front of you.
Choice.
Yes. Yes. There's two pieces to my personal identity. My inner self and my exposed self.
I think some things you can control on your exposed self, some things you can't control. If I was physically, if I was burned horribly in a car fire or something like that, I wouldn't say that my identity is now a disfigured human. It's like, no, that doesn't affect who I am. It's just, the physical body that I'm walking around in.
It may affect your behavior.
It might, sure.
If you have one leg shorter than the other,
Maybe
you're going to walk
my
away.
confidence. If I suddenly, don't feel comfortable in my own skin, then I may no longer be as outgoing as I. But I think that when we say identity, we're talking about more than just your physical properties. I think we're talking about a reflection of who you are on the inside.
This is actually mental properties. The things you think,
So what about
your
the
desires, your emotions.
heir to the king?
I'd say we're talking about gifting
1 second, Steve.
and choice, given the existence of the opportunities that God lays before us. Like those two things together.
So this would suggest that the core identity of who you are is independent of the circumstances in which you find yourself, where those circumstances may be as deep as the body in which you find yourself. Another question is, can Michael's labeled soul be dropped into a medieval priest, or alternately her in modern times? Could God have done either one of those? Or is it the case that the bodies that we have are somehow reflective of our identity? Does God equip us with an earth suit that matches the soul? That you can't necessarily wrinkle your nose at it, because back in the day, in Sherlock Holmes's day, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would turn around and say, like, look at this person's physical features. You know their character based on these physical features. Now, we know phrenology and stuff like that turned into be like pseudoscience, but there was enough evidence that people were like, this guy looks like a rat, therefore he is a rat. This guy looks like a kind person. How much of that had to do with the way that their face was actually structured versus the way that they held their face that our brains could actually detect microexpression type of stuff?
Mind-body dualism, and that's another.
No, I'm just asking the question. I mean, maybe, yeah.
That's another issue.
When the disciples saw this crippled man, the disciples like, who sinned? Was it him or his parents? And he's like, no.
Neither one.
Right, neither one. Like, there's not necessarily any sin here. Like, he was born this way so that God's glory could be shown at this time.
He lived his life all the way up to that point like that, so that Jesus could do this thing, and then he could.
It's not a reflection of his sin, though. So the fact that he's in a
could God have dropped your soul into that guy's body?
why not? Yeah.
I'm asking.
Could. Sure. You
Okay.
could have dropped me into that wicked priest, but then I don't think it would have been a wicked priest. I think it would have been
I said medieval.
okay.
Was that
So-
No,
implied?
I just heard
You
Oh,
can
okay.
say medieval, I heard evil at first.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, I was like, wow, that escalated quickly.
God has
As the
these
Middle Ages
souls.
are all out.
God has these souls, and he's just waiting for a body to come out and plug. The guy.
This is not a new idea. The concept of the well of souls goes back thousands of years. Of that, basically, God created these souls, and they're in stasis, and vitrified in the freezer
Right.
until he breaks them out of cryo and drops them into their body.
So,
Seth, and then Mike.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of identity of just like how to find something and it's that thing and not something else, if like all of reality is like a movie, a bunch of frames, and it's like, okay, it's like God is like, okay, how do I find Scott in this like big thing? It's like, oh, Scott is like born on this date, and it's like the first frame that he shows up in. Or is it like, okay, Scott is like when I created the world, he was sitting here on this like thing in this pot until then he moved into this body, but he was like in every frame before that, existing since I started creation. I think it's probably the.
So to get to this point, I'll simplify it for us, and it may not be that this is right, but let's simplify it and say, let's say that we will never know the answer to that until God directly tells us. But one of the things that we can take out from that is God chooses whether he grabs from the reservoir, or whether he creates it anew, or whether it arises in some way from where he chose, what genetic code he chose to allow to show up at this point, if it's somehow inextricably linked to your physical body. in any of those cases, it's God who does the initiation. So given that it's God who does the initiation, and in all of those cases, we find ourselves conscious of this problem at a minimum after we're already equipped, both in time and space, context, culture, society, wherever we are, physical attributes, age, all of that. We have woken up to the question of like, who am I? So you already came with a bunch of stuff. So let's say at a minimum, God put you there. Now you're asking the question, who am I? How do we answer that question?
So I'm going to fall back on some reading that I just did by this book, Love Thy Body, by Tracy. Awesome book. In it, she goes over repeatedly this concept in Christianity that we have about how we are embodied souls. We have both a body and a soul that are intertwined together, both of them given to us by the Creator. You can no more deny your physical body than you can deny your metaphysical being. And in this world, because of sin, because of corruption, because of the fall, we don't always have the best, perfect body, but you can't deny what you have either. So it's a fusion of the two. It's not purely metaphysical, as I was maybe saying earlier, and it's also not purely physical. I think we have to mesh them.
Okay.
So Scott,
Yeah, Steve.
so in that scenario, you say that this person was created by God. They're figuring out what their purpose is and who they are. I would say then that they're an entity or creature created by God, and that they should be seeking God for what is their purpose. Why did God create them? And I think there's something unique in that I don't know if we completely captured yet.
No, that's the whole question we're asking. That's right.
Is what does God say?
Yeah.
So with the stone, when I first heard that mentioned, I thought, well, that's kind of cool, because that kind of means that there's a stone with my name on it in heaven that kind of indicates who I really am. But when I read the passage, it says, to the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone.
Yeah.
That no one knows except the one who receives it. So that kind of says, well, it's not set in stone.
But it will be.
There's a new name written on this stone.
Yeah.
And that seems to be yet to determine.
Is that new name written on the stone? You have done all of this stuff up to here, so you have earned this name or have identified yourself this way? Or is it it doesn't matter what you did up to this point. I'm telling you, new job, new identity, new whatever else, here's who you are from here on out. We don't know. But let's say, back to the question of, and to Steve's point of this is the question we're asking. Here you are, you've woken up to the question, let's say that it's today, let's say it's or 3 weeks ago or whenever it was, that you've never considered who you are. You've never considered what your identity is, or at least you're looking at it afresh. And your question is, who am I? Is it the case that when you wake up to this question, the answer is, we're Christians, so the answer is God's got something to do with it? Is the answer, God is like, yep, thanks for waking up to the question. I know who you are. Ask me and I can tell you if I want to. This is who you are. Or is it the case when you wake up to the question that it's not who am I, that the question is who do I want to be? And that now you can choose. Or is it a third option of this is a cooperative effort where God says, this is who I want you to be, and you say, this is who I want you to be, and God's like, let's come to a middle ground on it. And that sounds, let's say there's a less obviously wrong answer, where God says, well, I've given you certain things, and you say, well, I would like to do this. And God says, okay, that's one of the 3 options I had for you. I'm going to let you pick among those 3 options. Okay, I want option B. All right, given that it's option B, this is what I want you to do, but in the future, you'll run into 2 other options, and it's this back and forth. Does God say there's only one way to be, or does he say there are 5 ways to be, you get to choose, just don't choose the other 6 through 10?
Just a feeling, I don't feel like I can justify it right now, but just a feeling that if we're right on this whole God created us as willful beings so that we could choose to join him in creation, then I feel like we can choose some element of that.
Okay. Is the only element you can choose whether you do good or bad, or do you get to choose among the other things? Does God, a silly answer to this one is, does God care what clothes you wear, what color shirt you wear? You could have bought that shirt in navy blue or whatever color red that is. Does God care? Or is that one of those choices where he's like, no, totally up to you. Style is fine. I'm asking. You have to tell me. I'm the one asking.
I think all those questions can be rephrased about
It depends.
saying what's important, what's not important.
Yeah.
Because if they say like, who am I? It's like, what about me is important.
Yes.
If I say, who should I be? It's like, what is important that I'm not?
Yes.
And that's a question of, what's important and who decides what's important. And I think if God's in the picture, then what God says is important matters. If God's not in the picture, then it's like whatever feels good or whatever the person wants to do.
Well, let's say God is in the picture. Does that mean everything matters? Shirt color matters?
Did he tell you to wear a certain shirt?
Does he expect you to wisely decide that blue is better than red?
Potentially in a unique circumstance.
Okay.
What if the idea of like your soul being like a painting, and like God starts out, he gives a painting of the soul, but then as you make decisions and actions, you're painting on the canvas, and so God doesn't care necessarily about every single stroke like that, but he does want to make sure it's beautiful or good by the end.
Yes.
And so he doesn't care if you put red or blue, but there are certain colors in painting that probably wouldn't go too well together.
So this is an interesting metaphor. You have seen presumably YouTube videos or something where somebody makes a mistake and then the artist incorporates that mistake into some obviously beautiful eventuality. And so it may be the case that God, like if we can literally say he works all things together for good, and his children occasionally make mistakes, and he even works your mistakes into what's good, and paints a beautiful picture by the end of it. So is your identity, though, the portrait that's left at the end?
I think it's like maybe your life is your progression. So some might say, like, let's say I'm halfway through my life, who knows how far, but like you have a snapshot of that. The next day, technically it's different, but it basically looks the same because not much has changed since yesterday. So some might say that is the same, but if you look in detail, maybe having this cup of coffee added just a little bit. So technically it's a new drawing, a new painting, but most people would say it's about the same because you added one little dash of paint.
Okay. Okay.
You said the end. And I thought, okay, so when we enter into heaven.
Yeah, as soon as I said that, I realized I
Well,
was
does
like,
change
maybe
stop? I mean, are we in heaven now? I assume, will we continue?
To change?
It seems like our identity, what we do is certainly in flux. You know, if our identity is what God ultimately, I mean, how can it be an ultimate in eternity? Sorry. Never mind.
Well, in my guess, I think there is an ultimately, but there's a lot of change and growth that happens all the way up to that ultimately, that is post entrance into heaven.
What about the definition of identity that's the set of important properties that a specific person has at time t?
How do you define it? How do you parse important from unimportant?
That's the second question, but it's the ones that are identity are the ones that are important.
Okay, granted. Now, how do you tell which ones are important?
All right, that's a separate topic.
Yes, but I'm asking it now. We're now onto that topic.
I'd say, assuming God's judgment, the properties that will impact your verdict.
Very good. So here we are to the question that I asked 30 minutes ago. What are we going to be judged on?
I see how well we did. Well done. I mean,
Yeah, but well done, a good and faithful servant. If the servant is
your response
an agricultural laborer whose job was to plow, then well done, good and faithful servant meant you got up, you went out, you hooked up the ox, you plowed well.
Your response given the amount of revelation that you received.
Okay? Revelation about?
I'm sorry.
about God.
Doesn't
Okay.
it matter not that?
So what about spiritual gifts?
Hold on one second.
People around you while you're plowing. I mean, it's how you. I mean, what your vocation is. I can't say it doesn't matter, but it seems incidental to how you treat the people you're in contact with while you're doing whatever you're doing.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
It's to plow, it's to love, to
Yeah.
maximize love. So
Yeah, that's an interesting theory.
Okay. So, what do we conclude based on that?
I think your question to, how are we judged? If we're saying that the important properties, I would say that means the same thing as like your essential properties, so that's a subset. So I think we're judged on how we express those essential properties of our identity, given our opportunities to express them.
Okay.
So, and I think what we should stop doing is saying like, I'm a laborer, therefore I'm not anything else. I'm not a lover of other people. I'm not a giver of service or whatever,
Right.
I'm just a laborer because like, okay, I'm an engineer, but okay, I'm also a people manager, but I'm also like managing the finances. I'm doing more than one thing. And so I think that's just kind of convoluted.
Consider the verse of like, whatever your hand finds to do, do it heartily, like unto God.
Yeah.
Which is almost like, it's not just overinterpretation, but I don't care what you do. Just do a good job and act like God's your boss. Okay?
And so I think that's how we're judged. I also have a theory about the painting and the stone with their name on it.
Yes.
You've got a couple seconds.
Shoot.
Okay, so I think, have people ever seen the videos where like someone creates a painting with light by using like super long exposure?
Yes.
And so he may like use a light stick or whatever. All right. And so imagine the light stick is a representation of our essential properties that are expressed
Okay.
out from the plane of space-time. So you got a ring of all the frames of time and space that you're constrained to, and you're expressing these essential properties. The camera lens that captures that throughout the course of your life is the stone beyond space-time, the realm of heaven that is being imprinted with that picture. And then when your course in space-time has concluded, the image that's written up onto that stone that's your identity. And that's what you'll be judged against.
You can't judge against it because it was what you did.
Yeah, okay.
So what are you judged against?
Yeah, I think that last part was probably not as well thought out. But I think you're judged against how the lights.
No, you're on the right track. So here you've painted this picture. This is who you are. I don't think you have to get extra dimensional for it. You can say this is an aggregation of all of the things that you have done, where the things that you have done in a moral sense maybe are the ones that matter. Maybe all the things that you've done matter. But it is that picture is getting measured against some other picture to say how much conformity are there between the two. Where let's say there were three pictures. Here's the picture of what you were. Here's the picture of what a bad version looks like, and here's a picture of what a good version looks like. And did it conform to the good version, or did it conform to the bad version? Was it a good and faithful servant? Was it an evil or wicked servant? Or is there some spectrum, and you're like, yeah, it kind of looks a little bit like this, but mostly like that. Okay, you're in. How does that work?
Yeah, I think the other two pictures aren't there. I think there's one picture, and God says, I'm going to judge whether this is desirable for me or not.
Okay.
For God.
Okay.
I don't think he said, I don't think he had a
Do we know how he judges whether it's desirable for him?
I don't believe that that's possible to
know that. Okay. That may be the case. What then do you do with his statement of the standards that Jesus gives of like, we're going to divide the sheep from the goats? The ones that were desirable were ones who had this particular set of behaviors, and the ones that didn't had that particular set of behaviors. Where this was basically compassionate, not compassionate.
Ones who are saved, it's not saved.
Yeah, I think that's a portion of how we'll be judged.
Okay.
Not
Probably, right, okay.
With respect to judgment, with God's foreknowledge, does he know how you will be judged?
Yes,
In the end, he already knows the answer.
yes.
I think
So
that's
judgment is, in God's terms, God the Father has already taken place.
So the tense version or expression of stuff,
I mean, doesn't this have to do with the Father is timeless, Christ, time exists with Christ, time does not exist.
you can, but you have to, we're comparing it to now for us.
How do you
So
reconcile the two?
The atemporal thinking may say something like this: the world was, is, and will be this way, or this is the totality of the space-time world, and this is the way that exists. And God can, let's say, some people say God perceives it all at the same time atemporally, but for you,
in effect, it collapses though.
no, it stays extended. But because he can turn around and say, if someone's going to make a statement at here's the whole cylinder, if you're going to slice it right here, the statement, Bill will be born, is either true or false at this time. And depending on where that slice was taken, it's true or false. So if it happens before you were born, then it's true. If it happens after you were born, it was false. So how the statement gets made in tense time is true or false based on its location. Because there are temporally dependent truths, God has to know whether the expression of that was temporally properly ordered. Which is, forget about it for now. The idea is, in the cases where God is thinking about what we will do or knows what we will do, we don't care what God knows at this point. We just care about what we know because we're having to make a decision based on now for us.
So in effect, we're talking about Christ in time, where all things were created through him and for him.
Yes.
So our creation is created in a period of time, but yet God the Father knows.
He knows how it'll end. Yeah.
What the outcome is.
Yes.
What the outcome of my judgment will be when my time comes to an end.
Yeah, that's right.
Which one? So it's identity for a Christian, like at a given time, how well one has freely chosen to be closer to being perfectly loving.
I will say this. Anytime where I've done a good job of that, that's what I want my identity to be. Right? Like if I did a really good job of choosing to be God's servant, son, whatever else, then if somebody asked me, how do you want to be identified? If they turned around and said, like, you know what? You have done an amazing job. They would not say this. But if you have done an amazing job of being God's son, adopted son, how do you want to identify yourself? I'd be like, that one, I'll take that one. Or if God does say to us, well done, good and faithful servant, people are like, what's your identity? I'd be like, a good and faithful servant. What's yours? Right? That's what I would want it to be. Does that imply anything about what it is?
Well, I said the identity is how well.
Yes.
So if you say, I want my identity to be good on that, you still have an identity of where you are.
But is that identity identical to that description? Or is that just a part of it? Or is it something different? When somebody says good and faithful servant, was that an identity statement? A statement about your identity? Or was that a mere descriptor that did not conform to your identity?
If it's true, then it is.
If it's true, then it is a
statement of.
Is it a statement that encompasses all of your identity, or is it only one property?
The most important aspect.
Okay. So you're the one who did important. So now we're back on important.
So with identity, one thing I said earlier was if I think of myself as kind and generous, but I treat people mean and stingy. As I was thinking about being judged on whether we visit the sick, I thought, well, maybe I should get to that. And then I thought, I could do all that, like, while I'm visiting you jerk, I don't like you, without saying all this. What goes on in my heart might be completely different than me fulfilling the...
And the research that we do on this is very clear. People always rate themselves as more honest than they actually are, more generous than they actually are, frequently more intelligent than they actually are, etc. And that's not all the time, but in aggregate, we tend to always think better of ourselves than we really do. So we're always a little bit delusional,
as I do that, as I start begrudgingly
Yes.
act like a good and faithful servant, I'm pretty sure, I think I've experienced this, that it starts to become, practicing, it starts to become who you act like you are.
But if you're faking it, is it faking it?
Well, if you're faking it, you're still doing it. Unless you're conveying to the person, I don't really want to be here, you're just a jerk, but I want to get my points with God,
Well, that was Christ's complaint with the Pharisees. They were showing one thing,
Right.
but the Bible says over and over and over, but he knew their heart.
Outwardly.
He knew their heart. So in their heart, they weren't, they had a problem.
People, Paul says, people who will not, maybe James, people who will not go to heaven, idolaters, murderers, liars, blah, 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 blah. If you murder somebody, are you a murderer? Is that your identity that you're a murderer? Who are the murderers he's talking about? So David murdered somebody. Did David not go to heaven? What changed David from being a murderer to not? Who are the murderers or idolaters and whatever else Paul was talking about? Liars? Has anybody in here ever told a lie? Are we all out? What's the difference?
Repentance. Whether or not they've made a choice after that temporal point to reconcile.
Which seems to imply, if you take that line of reasoning, that we choose a little bit of who we are. Yeah.
But repentance doesn't make you not a murderer anymore, though. Once you murder somebody,
But that's the reason we're doing it.
well, yes, forgive a murderer.
I still like the definition
Murdered,
of,
but you're not defined as a murderer.
Sorry, say again?
I was saying that you are still a person who has committed murder, but you're not defined
Defined as a murder. That's not your identity. Okay.
I still like the definition of identity is gifting, basically what's on the painting to begin with, plus choices, probably moral choices, in the presence of a God-directed environment. So God has an awful lot to do with what's on the painting to begin with and what arena you're put in, but what you choose is really how you influence your identity.
My own view is most closely aligned with that expression, is that you're dealt a hand by God, but that almost doesn't matter what hand you are dealt. What matters is what you do with it. And that it is either you painting with the colors that God put on your palette, or it's you and God painting together, which I think is the right model. With the whole, like, what is the Spirit doing with us? Presumably it's not just spectating. Presumably the Spirit, he is doing something and helping us paint. And if you've ever tried to paint with your kid, you might help guide their hand a little bit initially, and then eventually you let them do it a little bit on their own, and eventually they can do a beautiful job as well. Maybe it's something like that. But the identity that we care about, let's say that we have difficulty even answering the question. I posit for you the following question. Would you rather be told your identity, or would you rather have an option to shape it yourself? Go ahead.
I like that. I was just gonna ask humorously, are these components additive or multiplicative?
Right.
And then can we assign weighted values on each one so we can figure out what I need to maximize?
Right. So how the equation is structured, we will talk about next time. But that's the question that basically is, I think it's down to, how much of that is true, how much of this can you choose, and how much of it can you influence. And at the end of the day, is Jesus's identity is not itinerant preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead. What's his identity? He is the king who happened to have that series of events happen to him. But at the end of the day, his identity doesn't have anything to do with what actually happened. Right? I'm trying to eventually something will. The fact that he's the king, how much of that has to do with what happened to him? How much of his identity came from the things, the situation in which he found himself? I would say 0. God could have dropped him in, if he chose, into 100 years later or 100 years before into a slightly different role, into a significantly different role, and still had it play out in such a way. And he chose that time for maybe for reasons we don't know. But ultimately, Jesus' identity as King and Lord, which I think we would say are the important points. I forgot what the term was we used. I think we used important. I think we used the most desirable, the ones we would self-identify as. It seems to be separate in some way from the actual work in which he did in the situation in which he found himself. So let's ponder that this week, and maybe on Thanksgiving Sunday, we will bring this to a conclusion. So solid ground, but yeah.
So if in the scripture it says we are co-heirs with Christ.
Yes.
So that would be a significant thing if his identity.
Yeah, that's right.
And I put something in the chat or in the Facebook thing about 1 Corinthians that I can ponder later.
Okay. Quick question. Does anybody not have a place for Thanksgiving? Anybody looking for a place to eat dinner, whatever else? Do you know anybody like that? If so, let us reach out, let us know. Other than that, have a great Thanksgiving week. Ponder this one. Thank you, Mark, for pondering and sharing that with us. And now I think we have a really good question to focus in on. If that's the way it was for Jesus, how does it work for us? And then the next question obviously is going to be, how do you find out what your identity is? And does it have any implications for what you do now? In short, if Jesus knew he was going to be the king and that this was the job the Father had for him here, did that affect how what he was going to do? And should it be the same for us? All right, thank you very much. We'll see you next time.